Working on the steering wheel of a Ford Explorer is really pretty easy. Anybody can do it with some basic tools. The first thing we're going to do is park the vehicle in a good spot where it can sit for a while we work on it. The next step depends on which version of an Explorer you have. If you have an Explorer with a column shifter, like I do, then you're going to want to leave the vehicle in neutral while you do this work. If you have a Ford Explorer with a console shifter, then just leave the vehicle in park. But since I have a column shifter, I'm going to go ahead and put it in neutral. So I'm going to put my foot on the brake, move it to neutral, keep my foot on the brake so the vehicle doesn't roll, and apply the parking brake with my left foot. Okay, so now the vehicle has the parking brake on, the manual parking brake, but the column shifter is in neutral. So now I'm going to go ahead and shut the vehicle off. Since I have mine in neutral, it will not allow me to remove the key, so the key will remain in my ignition for the remainder of this job. But again, if you have a console shifter, you would just have it in park and you would be able to remove your key if you even have a physical key. So the first real step in accessing the steering wheel and removing the components is actually removing the airbag from the middle of the steering wheel. But before we can do that, we must ensure the vehicle is de-energized. Once the vehicle is parked where you want it and you have engaged the parking brake, go ahead and disconnect the battery. So I'm removing the cable from the negative post of the battery. In my case, and in the case of many vehicles, you'll need a 10mm socket or nut driver. So now that this is disconnected, the vehicle will begin to de-energize. It will take some time, so let the vehicle set. And meanwhile, position this cable in a location where it can never accidentally reconnect to the terminal of the battery. And it's even a good idea to wrap this in a towel or piece of tape or something like that, something thick enough that it would prevent this from ever reconnecting should it swing over to the battery post. Removing the airbag is very easy if you have the right tool. My favorite tool that I found in my toolbox was a 4mm T-handled Allen wrench. This works quite well, but I've also removed the airbag with a small screwdriver, something like this. It just needs to be a slotted screwdriver or something with a flat nose on it. And that's really the only requirement, is that you need a long stick, basically, that's straight and has a flat end on it. So again, this 4mm T-handled Allen wrench will be my tool of choice. I recommend you take whatever tool you have and measure up on the stick, whatever your stick is, 2 7/8 inches and make a mark. You can see on mine here, I put a Sharpie mark there. It's barely visible, but I can see it with my naked eye, and you can see the reflection there. So that Sharpie mark at 2 7/8 inches will be your friend. I'll see if I can make it a little more visible for you by rubbing some soapstone on it. So it's slightly more visible there. Okay, so that mark at 2 7/8 inches will be what helps us in the next step. Once you've let your vehicle set and ensure that it is de-energized, that nothing you do, pressing on the brake pedal, turning on the lights, will make anything light up in any way, and giving it extra time just to make sure that the airbag is de-energized, it is safe to remove the airbag then with your airbag removal tool. So this tool that we made here, my Allen key with the soapstone mark, is what will allow us to do that. There are 2 holes on the steering column. Right here. This is one on the left side. And then you can see there's the corresponding hole on the right side. And all you have to do to remove the airbag is take a tool like we have here and insert it into that hole. And there's lots of stuff you can hit in there, especially if you angle this at odd angles, but we want to go straight in and we can be pretty confident that we've hit the correct thing, the correct object, if our soapstone mark, or if the tool stops when the soapstone mark is at the edge of the hole. So see right there? So that means that we are on the right object, because this is going straight in and our mark is at the edge of the hole. So knowing that, we can now use this to remove the airbag. And now I'll show you how. So with your tool inserted to that point, to your mark, you want to apply just slight pressure towards the dash on the tool, and then a few pounds of force inward. So the tool will insert further past the mark that you've made, and you'll feel it push in, and you might have even seen the airbag move here. That means we've released this side of the airbag, the left side of the airbag. So now we don't want it to pop back in, the airbag that is. So I'm just going to keep an eye on it and maybe keep a hand on it to make sure that it does not pop back in. And we're going to do the exact same procedure on the right side. So we've inserted our tool straight, and it stopped on that mark, just like you saw a moment ago. I'm going to apply just ever so slight pressure towards the dash, and then a few pounds of force inward. And then you saw the airbag move again. I can pull my tool out, and the airbag should pull free. And just like that, the airbag is free. Now, you just have to remove the two connectors that are on the back of the airbag. And again, do not do this unless the vehicle has been fully de-energized. But just come in, hit the plate, move it back until you feel it just get behind the plate, and then you can hear it tapping the spring. I'm just moving it back and forth. And then while holding it against the back of the plate so that it doesn't slip around the spring, just apply force on the spring. And it's fairly stiff. Once you have physically loosened the airbag from the steering wheel, the last step is to remove the two connectors on the airbag. So these connectors vary vehicle to vehicle, model to model, and even sometimes year to year. But generally, they will take one of two styles. Either they will have a lock, like these orange sliding locks, or they will have squeeze tabs that you can just squeeze with your fingers and remove them. Squeeze tabs are often on the side. So in my case, I have a 2016 Ford Explorer, and this generation of Explorer has these sliding locks on top of the connectors. So to remove them, all you need is a slotted screwdriver, and you just start working these locks upward, and eventually you can get a screwdriver in this large open end here of the lock and just pop it up. Once they're popped up, the connectors just pull off of the airbag with very little effort. If you have the squeeze tab style connectors, then you just squeeze the tabs with your fingers, hold them together, and then pull the connectors off. So your connectors may or may not look identical to these, but just know that whatever they look like, be careful with them, because one, they're connected to an explosive device, which is your airbag, and two, you never know when you'll need to reuse a part, so just be mindful of that as you remove them. Once you disconnect your airbag electrically, now it is totally free of the vehicle, and you can set it in a safe spot. Be sure to place it somewhere where it would not damage or harm anyone or any property should it detonate. Better to be safe than sorry. Now that the airbag has been safely removed, we can safely work on the rest of the steering column. So the next step after removing the airbag is to disconnect the steering wheel from the clock spring. And that's actually this connector right up here. It's a, I believe, 12-pin connector. And all you do to remove it is squeeze this tab right up at the top. So you press down on a tab. So I'm going to do that with my index finger right there. If you can see that. And pressing down on that tab, and I'm going to press down and then kind of grab the bundle of wires and pull the plug out. So that is very simple, very easy to do. So this plug stays with the steering wheel, and it is really the only plug on the steering wheel that we have to deal with. If you had a heated steering wheel, you would have another plug right down here. So you would need to unplug that as well. But now our steering wheel is disconnected. These connectors for the airbag, this actually stays with the clock spring, so we don't need to worry about that. So these, we just want to make sure all these are loose. So then the only thing holding the steering wheel on mechanically, it is now disconnected electrically. Mechanically, the only thing holding it on is this screw right here. So this is a Torx T50 screw, or I should say it takes a T50 Torx bit to remove it. So this screw should not be extremely tight. I would not use power tools to remove it unless, you know, deemed absolutely necessary. But I'm going to remove it with a hand ratchet. And sometimes these are, you know, a little bit awkward to remove just because when you go to turn them, of course, counterclockwise for removal, the steering wheel is going to want to spin. So if you have one that is a little bit tight, just get a second person. This is really the only step that might require a second person, and have them hold on to the steering wheel for you as you turn that screw. And then it should be no problem at all. So right there, you can see mine broke loose, and I just held the steering wheel in place with my knees. Again, this does not always work, so be prepared to have a second person for this part of the operation. And here's our screw. It's a decent sized screw because it is the only screw or bolt that is holding the steering wheel on mechanically. You can see it had a little bit of thread locker on it, but it looks very clean, so I'm going to set it aside. With our center bolt or screw removed, the steering wheel is now very loose. There's mechanically nothing really holding it on to the steering column any longer. So now we can pull it off the steering column. So we're going to move the steering wheel connector out of the way. It stays with the steering wheel. And then with one hand on the steering wheel and one hand on these airbag connectors, I'm just going to wiggle the steering wheel off while fishing these connectors back through. And just like that, you can set the steering wheel aside. After you move the steering wheel, you're able to see and spin the clock spring. This is the clock spring. It's essentially a rotary union that just has some wires inside that go around in a circle. And so as the steering wheel spins, those wires also move inside, and that keeps the steering wheel connected. You can actually hear some broken wires in there. That little clicking sound, if you can hear that, those are broken wires. Even though this is partially broken, we don't want to break it even more. What that means is that we want to prevent this from rotating any more than necessary. So I'm going to take a piece of tape, some electrical tape for now, and just temporarily try to tape this in place. This is really just a reminder to myself not to spin this. The next step in order to remove the clock spring is to remove the plastic shrouding around the steering column. So I've actually already started doing that. It's just barely holding on. These pieces snap together, just like much of the paneling in the cab here. And so you have to carefully pop these apart to release the snaps from either side. A couple of other things that you need to do is lower your lever here for your steering wheel adjustment. So lower that out of the way. And then there are 3 screws that you have to remove. Here is one. There was one up in there. There's one up in there. And there was one over here. Okay, so there's 3 screws on the underside, there, and there. And they all take a 7mm nut driver or a 7mm socket. So I removed those, and then I started popping this apart, and it's pretty much totally popped apart. In my case, because I have a column shifter, I need this column shifter to be in the neutral position. That's why that was the first thing that I did at the start of this replacement job. So move this in the neutral position so that I can fish this over the shifter. If it was in the park position, it would be too close to the dash and too awkward to remove. So I'm going to go ahead and finish taking this off here. So you can see the bottom dropped free. The top has no screws holding it in place. It is just held in place with the snaps against the lower section. And then this lifts up over the turn signal lever. There we go. I was still hooked on the bottom piece a little bit over there. So then this just comes right out, and you can see the snaps. They're the little tabs that go down into the bottom piece. So the trick is always to just pop these panels apart without damaging the snaps. That way you can get it back together. And now this panel drops down. The other thing is that on mine, there's an adjustment here for the pedals, and you just reach in there and pull this connector off. So it's plugged into the switch there, and it's very easy to remove. You just have this one compression tab here. You just squeeze that tab and the plug pulls out. So now that the 3 screws and that plug are removed, there's nothing holding this in place, except in my case, the shifter. And so then I just have to fish it up over the shifter. And now it is free. So I can also set this aside. Now you can see the clock spring on all sides. So it is just this round body here, and there's 4 screws holding it in place. Screw 1, screw 2, screw 3, and screw 4. So these are T10 screws. They're Torx screws, as you can see right there. So now we have to remove those 4 T10 screws. And then the clock spring will just pull right off. So I have a T10 Torx bit in the end of my multi-purpose nut driver here. And I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of these. Now these screws are just screws going into plastic, so they're not very tight. They don't need to be very tight. So just go easy when removing and reinstalling them. So now there's nothing mechanically holding the clock spring in place. The last thing electrically holding it in place is this plug right down here. So we're going to unplug it from the bottom of the clock spring. And like the rest of these, it's just a squeeze tab. It's on the left side, so I'm squeezing it with my index finger, and then pull the plug right out. And then just gently pull the clock spring towards you while wiggling it, and it will disconnect it from the module behind it. There we go. So there is our clock spring. So now there is nothing more we need to do here before reinstalling or installing the new clock spring. So I'm going to grab that now. It's always good to check your old part against your new part to make sure that they look like the same part. That way you know the swap should go as planned. In my case, there is actually a slight difference, but it's one that I was aware of when I went into it. So when I looked at my old part number, you can see it ends in AC there at the top, and on the new part number, it ends in BC. Otherwise, the part numbers are the same. That difference, the AC to BC, is that the new one is compatible with heated steering wheels. In the old clock spring, there's this empty socket right here. And on the new one, that empty socket is actually populated with a connector. You can see the 2 pins in there. And so that's the input for the heated steering wheel, and the output is right here. So, and it also has 2 pins. And as I showed you on the steering wheel a few minutes ago, there is a socket in the steering wheel for this connector to fit through. So I think it should be a perfect swap, even though this is slightly different. It's still made for my make and model of vehicle. It was just a different trim level, but I think it is still compatible. I also want to point out this white key here. This is to prevent the clock spring from rotating. Just like we put a piece of tape on the old one, the new one comes with this key to lock it in place. So we will keep that key in place until we install the steering wheel. When you install the clock spring, be very mindful of this connector here. It is attached to the steering column control module, and the clock spring plugs directly into it. That's where these pins on the back of the clock spring go. So there's no harness, there's no plug. The clock spring itself is a plug that goes into that connector. So when you're installing it, just be very mindful of those, because you don't want to bend the pins on your clock spring. The process of installing the new clock spring is just the reversal of the removal process. So take your time and make sure all the screw holes get lined up. Make sure that it's piloted on any studs properly. It's a good idea to just take a look at the pins that are down on the bottom. Make sure they're lined up with the connector that are on the steering wheel control module, and then gently press it into place. So we're going to reuse the 4 screws that we removed. And again, these screws do not need to be very tight. Just snug them up. Okay, all 4 screws are in. I'm just going to do a quick check, make sure none of them are loose. And that's it. The clock spring is installed. So I'm not going to reconnect the large connector on the bottom. If you have a heated steering wheel, you would now connect it now. The plug is over here on the left side. Okay. So now the next step for me is to reinstall this piece, the trim piece that goes underneath the steering wheel. I'm going to fish it down over my shifter. I'm going to plug back in the connector down that's in this shroud that goes to the pedals to move the pedals up and down. And click your connector into place just like that. So this cover also kind of indexes off of the turn signal over here, so just make sure that that's lined up. Okay, so in my case, the wiring harness for this pedal switch over here that I just reconnected, it's actually getting in the way of this installation. It's getting pinched, so I'm just going to move it. I'm going to move it to the right over here, and then try this again. So I had to look down in there and line up the bosses for the screws, those 3 screws that are on the bottom. The bosses sort of have a cup, and they have to go up over a stud that's on the steering column. So I just didn't have them quite lined up properly. And that harness was in the way a minute ago. So now I'm going to go ahead and get my 3 screws and screw them up into place. So here's an underside view of this trim piece. So you can see we have hole 1, hole 2, and hole 3. These 2 holes that are closer to the driver take a screw that looks like this. It's in my case, a silver finish screw, and it is. These are going into plastic. The one in the rear is a black screw, and it is going into metal. The screw in the back is a little bit tricky because, at least in my trim piece, there are 3 holes at the end of this pocket, and you really want it in the center hole. So that might be the trickiest of the three to get connected. The lower shroud piece is back installed. The 3 screws are in, so now we can move on to the upper shroud. So to install the upper shroud, all we have to do is slide it back behind the steering column. And to make this easier, I'm going to lower the steering column and lock it down. Lock it in the lowered position. Then I can slide this in. And using my flashlight, I'm going to line up the snaps on the back. Okay, and in my case, I have to line up this shifter boot as well. So now everything seems to be lined up. I'm just going to snap it into place by holding the bottom cover and pressing the top one downward. So there's 3 on the right side, so I just got those, and so now I'll go to the left side. 1, I think 2 and 3 went at the same time. Okay, so the shroud is now back on. I'll just leave the steering column where it is. This gear shifter, now technically I could put it into park, but I'm just going to leave it right where it is. So now we're ready for the steering wheel. We parked the vehicle with the wheels straight, and so that makes this really easy because the steering wheel just goes on straight. And the clock spring is also straight. This white tab is at the top. So everything is very easy to index right now. These yellow studs that are on the clock spring are going to go into these holes on the back of the steering wheel. And again, everything just lines up very easily because we parked the vehicle with the wheels straight. So I'm going to fish the airbag connectors through the steering wheel. And then that white key or lock that's on the clock spring will also fish through just like that. So now we have the airbag connectors fish through and this white key, and I can look at it and see that the white key will be able to be removed even after we bolt on the steering wheel. So I'm going to go ahead and put the screw in the center of the steering wheel. Okay, so just do a quick check and make sure that you've not forgotten anything, that everything is connected. We're now ready to torque this fastener down so that the steering wheel will be secured in place. So I have my torque wrench and I have it set to 40 foot-pounds. That appears to be a typical torque spec for these Explorers. And now I'm going to try torquing it down to that. If I have trouble preventing the steering wheel from moving, then I will get a second set of hands here to hold the steering wheel for me. With the second set of hands, we were easily able to torque that screw to 40 foot-pounds. So now the steering wheel is mechanically in place, and we just need to work on the electrical. So before we can plug this steering wheel plug back into the clock spring, we have to remove this white key. This key or lock was what was keeping the clock spring from rotating before we had the steering wheel installed. So I'm going to go ahead and pull on this gently. Okay, and it popped right out. I'll actually put that in my old one to keep it from rotating. So just double check and make sure all your pins look correct. Nothing's bent. Everything looks good there. So I'm going to go ahead and push my steering wheel connector into place. So now the steering wheel is connected once again. Last but not least, we have to reinstall the airbag. So I've had the battery disconnected for a while now, over an hour, and you can see that nothing has power in here. So that means it should be safe to reconnect the airbag. So the airbag obviously goes like this, Ford logo up. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall these connectors. And they only go on one way. It should be impossible to mix these up, but just make sure that you're going blue connector to blue plug, and yellow connector to yellow plug. And then once you get the plugs inserted, if you have this generation of Explorer, which would be, I think, 2016 to 2019, then you'll have these orange locks to push in. Make sure they go in all the way. And now you can go ahead and reinstall the airbag. So then just push it into place and it will go into those springs. And that's all there is to it. So now the airbag's secured, the steering wheel's secured, everything moves. I'm going to go ahead and put it back into park. And now that the steering wheel is back together and the airbag has been fully reinstalled, it's safe to go ahead and reconnect the battery. So I'm going to put my cable back on the negative post. You'll see the vehicle immediately re-energize. So judging by the door chime and the interior lights, it's clear that the battery has been reconnected successfully. I'm now going to test the horn for the first time, which was not working before I replaced the clock spring. Another good job done. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I will also leave a link, or at least a listing of the part numbers that I replaced on this Explorer. So thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.